And welcome to another episode of Tree Actions, the Urban Forestry podcast. And with me, as always, is my trusted counterpart, Tony Tressel. Morning, Tony.
Good morning, everyone.
And excited to have our guest today, all the way from the right coast, or the east coast, from Nova Scotia, Peter Duinker. Welcome to the show, Peter.
Greetings. Glad to be here.
I'm looking forward to our session today. We're always trying to expand our guests to cover the country a little bit, even further. We're trying to get it. We've had one New Zealander and one European on. We'll hopefully get some more, but I'm happy to have a Maritimer. We always ask our guests one question to get started, and I don't see why we don't normally deviate from that. So, Peter, if you would share with us the first memory that you have or you recall feeling a connection to a tree or trees.
That's easy. I grew up before school age in the village of Sharon, which is about 60 kilometers north of Toronto. And beside our house, alongside of the driveway between us and the neighbor's yard, was a row of Norway spruce. And when I'm sure I was about 5, I don't think I could have been 4 to do what I did. I used to climb one of those trees that had a beautiful ladder-like branches all the way up to the top. So one day I was climbing that tree and I thought, I have to make the plunge and go right to the top. And so it was all I could do to muster up my courage to get up to the top. And then I discovered that I couldn't get down. And so there I was hollering for my dad. And my dad had to come up that tree and fetch me down.
Wow.
And that's one of my first recollections. There's a sister recollection where our house was very close to what's called the Sharon Temple. And the temple grounds had some new maple trees planted along the sidewalk, sugar maples, and they had no branches to grab except maybe 3 or 4 meters up. But I used to shimmy up those trunks, pulling myself up like a fire pole and making life miserable for the caretaker of the park. He'd rake the leaves into piles and I'd kick all the leaves back out of the piles. And so sugar maple, which is still one of my favorite species, and Norway spruce, which is one of my hated species on this continent.
Interesting. What would you say the height, how tall were these, the Norway spruce you climbed?
Yeah, the Norway spruce couldn't have been much more than, 15 meters at the time. I've been back, and so that would be 65 years or just over 65 years since. And they don't seem much taller. They seem about 20 meters now to maybe 22 meters. Those trees are largely all still there. But the sugar maples over in the park, they're now 40, 50 centimeters in diameter and 20 meters tall rather than 10 centimeters in diameter.
Yeah.
And, 10 meters tall.
Yeah. Wow. So that I think most of us can relate to being like sort of stuck in a tree. It's funny how it's always getting down that seems to be a little bit more of a challenge than getting up, even with climbing almost anything. It's an interesting phenomenon.
I would say the same for walking in hilly territory. The going up is, to me, much easier than the going down.
Yeah.
And I remember 20 years ago or so having really serious knee problems going down slopes. That's since gone away from me. But and that's why I like using hiking poles in my dotage. The poles help me get up by giving me my arms to help with that. And then my arms help again by giving me 4 points of contact with the earth rather than just 2. And so going downhill, you change the way that you use the poles to hold you back from stumbling down forward.
Yeah, I've done the same thing. And I've always thought poles but in more recent times, they're extremely valuable tools.
Very valuable.
Yeah, yeah. It made me think of the Grand Canyon. That's one. I don't know if you've ever done the Grand Canyon, but that's an interesting concept because it's quite a long way down. Quite a long hike, and then so it's inverted, and it's interesting how it does do a different number on the muscles, like that particular hike.
I drove down that way about 25 years ago when my son was a teenager, and we went to the north side of the Grand Canyon, and we got away from the parking lot and out onto one of the ledges that looks down over the canyon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah.
And I found that almost a spiritual experience to stand there and hear nothing but a little bit of wind and a few birds of prey, and to be able to see what felt like a kilometer down to the bottom of that thing. It was just so, if my lust for travel is waning in my older years, but that's one trip I wouldn't mind making, is to go down into the canyon and experience that.
It is. I've had the privilege of doing it once, and it was definitely, I'd happily do it again, and it was worth the trip for sure. It's just a different experience altogether, and I can relate to that sense of it's awe inspiring. I guess isn't it considered one of the wonders of the world? I'm not sure if it is, but
Probably.
it's a really impressive natural phenomena or
Indeed.
site. I don't know, Tony, have you been?
No, I haven't. Of all the places I've been in the world, the American Southwest is probably where I've been the least, but just haven't really got out to that part of the world yet. It's on the list though.
Well, it's funny. My trip there was I was on the ISA panel of experts for the track program, and we had a meeting in Phoenix, and a few of us decided that we would meet earlier, a few days before, and go to the Grand Canyon and hike it and do that. So that's how I ended up there. But it was a cool experience. So from north of Toronto all the way to Nova Scotia, explain to me a bit of that journey. How did you end up?
Well, sure. It's a bit of a long story, but we have some time.
Absolutely.
We moved from the village to a farm, not 10 kilometers further north, and my connection with trees continued there, particularly because I had a favorite sugar maple mature tree at the back of the farm to climb. But my brothers and I also built tree forts in cedars, and the smell of eastern white cedar is so deeply embedded in my being. And what I used to hate dramatically was when the truck came up the lane to the farmhouse, loaded with slabs from the local sawmill, and he dumped it at the back of the house. And of course, the boys had to get to work and pile that stuff inside the woodshed. And it was terrible. And then from there, we had another trip back to Sharon, but then we ended up on Manitoulin Island on a farm there. And that was during my teen years. And you couldn't burn me out of the woods. I just adored being in the woods with a saw, hand saw or a chainsaw, it didn't matter, cutting firewood for the farmhouse. I would rather do that than go to school. But it led me at the end of high school to want to combine my interest in agriculture and in forests. So I went to the University of Guelph, took an Aggie undergraduate program with a major in resource management. That university didn't suit me. So I left university, went to work on a farm in Saskatchewan. Then I came back to Ontario. I worked on a couple of Toronto golf courses where I was the tree guy. If they needed any tree maintenance done, it was me. I worked for Cedar Vale Tree Services in downtown Toronto. This was 50 years ago, and I was what they called at the time, Dwayne, a tree surgeon, which is a pretty foolish title. And then when I went back to university and things worked out, and then I was also fighting forest fires in northwestern Ontario for 3 summers, and that was the best job a young guy could have. And so that, I got kind of excited. After a year in Europe where my wife was studying music, I went to Dalhousie and took my master's degree in environmental studies, and I did a project of biomass estimation in the forests of Nova Scotia. And to my delight, my project was needed to cut down 300 trees and weigh them in the woods. So that was my master's project. Then there was a stint doing environmental assessment research here in Halifax, but I went for a PhD to UNB's forestry school and learned about forest management and policy and forest ecology there. And then I did a 2-year kind of a postdoc over in Europe at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, studying European forests and forest decline, which was pretty serious at that time, mostly because of the sulfur air pollution. And then I got a research chair at Lakehead University in the Faculty of Forestry there. And so my family spent 10 years at Lakehead. Meantime, we were always eyeballing Halifax as a wonderful place to move back to. And so in 1998, I got the job of my dreams, being director of the School for Resource and Environmental Studies. And the rest, they would say, is history. We've been here in Halifax for 27 years now and probably not leaving.
Beautiful. Beautiful. I have to ask about, I grew up in Saskatchewan. So where in Saskatchewan did you do some egg stuff?
Craven.
Yeah.
That's
Wow.
about 20 kilometers north and a little bit west of Regina.
Yeah, it's nice country.
Yeah, and the nice thing about it is, I can get pretty tired of the flat stuff, but the farm was right on the Capel Valley, not
Yeah.
in it, but on the edge of it. So there was a nice relief in the
Yeah.
countryside and actually trees in the ravines.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's quite beautiful. In fact, it's I think the furthest west the native stand of elm go. And
Yeah, could be so. I wasn't paying that much attention at the time.
yeah, it's about where they end. They don't go past there. It's sort of the last where they grow in the wild.
Right.
And then it gets, yeah. Well, that's fascinating. And I didn't know that. So did you do tree surgery or did you?
Well, I was there for the winter, so I started 1st of January, ended middle of April because I got this forest firefighting job for the summer. So I was only there 3.5 months, but for half that time, I was standing on the ground pruning low trees from telephone lines and power lines and so on. But then they
Okay.
shifted me to the takedown crew. And my boss said, Peter, you got to get up those trees. And of course, we didn't have buckets at the time. So we were
No.
climbing and we had very rudimentary climbing gear. I really envy the current climbers who have all this mountain climbing gear, all this special ratchets and all that kind of stuff. And all we had was 1/2-inch sisal rope and a leather belt and spurs.
Wow.
And
So,
so, yeah.
okay. So the belt, like it was leather.
Yeah.
Interesting. And did it have like a seat that you could sit in it, or did you more just lean into it?
I think there was a seat. Yeah. There was a seat, but it was very uncomfortable.
Right. And sizzle as well. So natural fiber rope and everything.
Natural fiber rope, 1/2 inch. That was all we were using. And you use the tools right? And you wouldn't want to go back to those tools at all, given the sophistication of the tools today. I look at the gear that people have, and my eyes glaze over because I don't know what half of it's for.
Yeah.
I did have
Yeah. No,
I got Tracy McKenzie to come down to Halifax one day a few years ago, just before the pandemic, and to give my students a little tree climbing tutorial.
yeah.
And so I saw then what fancy the gear was, and I was just kind of astonished. But I don't have the build to be a climber. I'm too heavy. I'm 6'4". I'm a good ball player, or I was, but I was not a good climber.
And so you would spur. Do you? I guess, did you ever rappel and hang off the rope, or did you usually use your spurs the whole time?
Well, if it's a takedown, the spurs, and if it's
Sure,
a
of course.
pruning, then I would be shimmying up the rope. But I didn't do it. I've watched your climbing competitions in the last 10 or 20 years, and I'm astonished at how guys can fling themselves around the tree with ropes in one strategic place high up in the tree. I've even had them climbing trees in my backyard because my backyard used to be full of Norway maples, and I'm a Norway maple killer here. And of course, you can't get a boom into my backyard, so the guys have to come in and climb.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's pretty impressive to watch good climbers climb.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just a thing of beauty, as my brother would say.
Yeah. And then a stint as a wildland firefighter in that time frame as well. Where you wouldn't have. Did you spend time in choppers and planes as well then, or was it?
Man, I've been in more choppers than you can name. I can't even name all the different kinds of helicopters I was in. It was a very exciting place to work out of Kenora because we were on the top end of the Lake of the Woods.
Yeah.
So, and northwestern Ontario has far more water in the landscape in lakes and streams than some of the drier parts, closer to Thunder Bay. There's still water, but not much. And so we had the wonderful experience of going to fires in the fireboat, to go down the Lake of the Woods in the fireboat.
Wow.
And of course in the crew cabs, but more in aircraft than any other means of transportation. And when you had a fire flap, which we had a fire flap every one of the 3 years I was there, then all helicopters come from everywhere. So you're in the monster helicopters that might have been used in Vietnam, for heaven's sakes, and then And then the small stuff that does, ferries cruise along the power lines to check them out and all that kind of thing. So I was in helicopters more than any other kind of vehicle for 3 summers straight. And for a young guy in his early 20s, there was no life more exciting than fighting forest fires. And, I come to Nova Scotia here and they say, yeah, we had a big fire, 100 hectares. Well, one of my first fires was 150,000 hectares. So I got a taste for big fires when I was in northwestern Ontario.
That's interesting. My son was a Halifax for a couple of years, and he actually was on mutual aid on a big fire, like of I don't know what magnitude, but in northern Ontario as well. And what was interesting there was that did you set tents in the woods? You had like
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a good life because while the work was long hours, and as a farm boy, I was used to that heavy work for long hours. But you could, of course, bill lots of overtime, which is how I put myself through university. But when you go out to a fire on initial attack, they would send you with a box of food that wasn't very exciting. It was click and cam in tins and various other things. But as soon as you were there for more than one night, then you could tell the helicopter pilot, I think you should be bringing in some steaks and some beer. And of course, we were extremely well provisioned for food when we were out on fires a little bit longer.
Well, that must be a tradition because that's one of the things my son commented on is the quality. And it was like they got these little tents and he said there wasn't really any instructions. They just sort of had to figure it out and they got the tents up and everything. But then it was the provisions that were brought like steak. And he said it was just unbelievable, like really good food.
So we had 2 kinds of tents, the old prospector tents that were canvas, heavy as lead with no floor. So you had to lay a tarp for the floor, and then they graduated to woods 5-man tents, and you put 5 guys in one of those woods tents, and it's cheek to jowl. It was not great accommodation. Our crews at the time were all men and 5-person crews, 1 tent. So we made do.
Yeah,
it was a good life.
Yeah, he really enjoyed his time there too, and here in Alberta. Fascinating. So your time in Europe, you were doing research there.
I was part of a big research group in the environment program at the Institute just south of Vienna, in which Canada was a member. And so this institute had a population program. It had a technology program. It had a climate program, which was kind of new at the time. And then a forest. In the environment program, there was a forest project looking at the long-term future of European forests under continuation of air pollution. So this was kind of an initiative to convince European countries to negotiate hard to get the air pollution down, because in a continent that small with so many countries, the pollution was being generated in neighboring countries and floating over to other countries. So it's not like Canada where if we emit some pollution in Saskatchewan, it's highly likely to end up in another part of Canada. And so it was mostly synthetic research. Like I wasn't in the field doing trials or anything. There was a lot of simulation modeling of the future of European forests and writing papers and all that kind of stuff. It was a pretty good transition from the PhD to the professorship.
I'm curious, what was there, or what is the origin or the cause of the air pollution? Was it manufacturing? Was it
power production from coal plants?
Okay. So for electricity then?
Yeah. And probably there was some coke making facilities as well. So turning coal into coke so it can make steel.
Yeah.
So there are some very serious industrial heartlands in Central Europe with a huge amount of sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxide pollutions. But a lot of that's been cleaned up. I've not been back to look at those kinds of questions in Europe, although I've been to Europe so many times. But you take the Sudbury situation.
Yes.
When we lived on Manitoulin Island, there was talk of a new superstack. And by 1974, that superstack had been built. And it was built expressly to get that sulfur dioxide pollution spread across a larger territory under the mantra that the solution to pollution is dilution.
Right.
Yeah. And so that was 50 years ago, and the superstack is now being pulled down. Interesting that the cost of removing it is more expensive than the cost to build it.
Wow.
Yeah. So anyway, it's
Well,
coming down over the, yeah.
Yeah. Well, Sudbury's an interesting thing because I was up there for a program. It was my first time up there. It was a few years ago now, but the change that's occurred and how they used to cook off with the open strips, like it was pretty desolate and there was like a moonscape. It really changed the place, didn't it? And they've done a lot to change it.
I know about Sudbury a bit because I married a girl from Sudbury and she's still my wife. So we've been back a lot I've been through there for the last 60 years. Sudbury used to have the name Queen Anne of the Pines. It was loaded with white pine. And they needed the white pine for building projects, but maybe largely for the roasting beds to smelt the ore when they started up. So the fumigation of the landscape was right on at the level of the land. And then when they changed the fuel and had these smelters with smokestacks, it was only, I don't know, 100 meters up, if that, maybe 50 meters up that the smoke came out and continued to toxify the land, not only with acids, but with heavy metals. And then finally, when the superstack went up, there was much less local pollution and, of course, a huge lot more of Eastern North America pollution. Here in Nova Scotia, we probably didn't get much from the Sudbury superstack, but the Ohio Valley was full of coal-burning plants making electricity. So that's where we got most of our acidification from. But once that superstack went up, the land started to kind of heal itself. But there were also huge initiatives to lime the soil, to get tree propagules put back out there. And it's just a very green landscape now. It doesn't have the majestic white pine forest of 150 years ago, but it's still a heck of a lot better than it was when I was courting my wife in the mid-70s.
Yeah, well, I people were talking about when I was there, and you could sort of see like I guess the staining on even on the rock, like, and that was like, and where it's changed, like you could almost like layers of almost see the evolution of it. It was quite surprising.
Yeah, and a lot of people with breathing difficulties because of the sulfur in the atmosphere around Sudbury.
And it reminded me, it reminded me of an old time Fort McMurray. In its day, it must have been just a real boom town, kind of like a gold rush town.
Yeah. No, I've never been to Fort, so I wouldn't know.
Yeah, just lots of money, quick, and everybody, just lots going on, and you got a lot of people concentrated in a area where you never used to be, and there's, it's just an interesting phenomenon that occurs with that sort of thing. But
Yeah.
I have to say, it is nice to see that it can have some healing, right, or it can do some change.
Right.
And even tree planting, I think even Tree Canada done some planting up there, haven't we?
We may have, but that would be before my time.
Yeah, I think
Excuse
there
me.
was some initiatives. I believe there was. I think your professorship at Dalhousie. I'm assuming that you started there as a prof then?
No, at Lakehead,
What
in the
Lakehead?
Faculty of Forestry there for 10 years.
Oh, okay.
And with no real particular interest in urban forests. It was all about the big hinterland forests and how we can manage them better. But I continued here in 98 as a prof at Lakehead, as a prof at Dalhousie, I'm sorry. And then still worked on huge amount of issues related to rural forests and rural forestry. But there was a triggering moment that got me drawn in to urban forests, and that was Hurricane Juan.
Okay.
Which visited us in September of 2003.
Yes.
If you know Halifax at all, you would know what Point Pleasant Park is, a 70-hectare park at the south end of this. It knocked down, well, not only a lot of trees in the rest of the city, but it blew down about 3/4 of the mature red spruce and white pine in that park. So the city immediately cordoned it off and put together a rehabilitation task force or something like that. And they asked me to join it. So I did. And then I worked with them on trying to figure out how to clean that place up. And then it was time to put together a comprehensive plan for the future of the park. And I joined that team to do that plan. And the city liked my work enough on that plan. They said, Peter, we need you on the urban forest master plan for the city. And so I said, okay, let's do that as a partnership between the city and the university. So a couple of us, including John Simmons, whom you know.
Yeah.
And John Charles, a planner, and I, the three of us, spearheaded the development of Halifax's first urban forest master plan. And then I started doing all kinds of research, not only to support the plan, but on other topics of my own choosing. Probably 3/4 of my work in the last 15 years has been dedicated to urban forests rather than rural.
Did, Dr. Shiga would often quip about the term urban forest, that it was a bit of an oxymoron in the sense that they kind of don't fit together, the two terms.
I don't agree with that at all. No, to me, I've always defined a forest as a tree-dominated ecosystem. All right, so a tree in a pot, if you bound it spatially to the pot, is a forest with one tree in it.
Okay.
And so an urban forest is, if you go to a city like, let's say, Tel Aviv, which I know has less than 1% canopy cover, it's hard to call that city, an urban forest. But Halifax, I would easily call it an urban forest with some pockets that are not wooded at all, like the downtown. But we've got anywhere from 20 in the low canopy cover neighborhood up to 50% canopy cover. So it actually is, in many respects, a tree-dominated ecosystem. And we want it to be more tree-dominated. So I don't define an urban forest as just a collection of trees, because if I'm strict about calling it a forest, a tree-dominated ecosystem, well, then you have to put all the bits of the ecosystem in there. And so an urban forest is dominated by trees, but they need soil, and they're occupied by all kinds of wildlife, and there's air moving through them, and there's water associated with them. So it's the whole package.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's definitely a term that's here to stay. I don't think there's any question about that.
Yeah, for sure.
And it definitely makes sense in a lot of respects. Like, do you think, like, when you look at downtown or the heart of downtown, where it's, the amount of available space, and also certainly the natural phenomena of what occurs in a forest floor, in a wild forest, let's say, how much that inhibits or changes the functionality of the tree itself?
Yeah, so in some respects, for example, if you're interested in shade provision and transpiration to cool the locality of the tree, well, a tree in downtown Halifax can do that as well as a tree out in the woods. And in fact, maybe it's more important, even if it does less of it, because it's so close to people. And we don't feel the shade of a tree out in the woods unless we're out in the woods with the tree. But we feel it, where we live. The tree right outside my house here, a massive elm tree, provides me with services, some of which are independent of the location of the tree, like the carbon sequestration, but many of which are totally dependent on its location, with my house and me right beside that tree. So it is tough to squeeze out of a tree in a really harsh hardscape, to squeeze out of that tree the full palette of benefits we associate with urban trees. That doesn't mean we shouldn't have them there. In fact, it means even more so that we should have them there, because some of those benefits you cannot assign to any other system. Sure, air conditioning, we can pay for that with equipment. But my elm tree sits on the south side of my house. It is my air conditioner.
Absolutely.
And the delight of things to look at. If you look at where people congregate on a hot summer day in a big grassy field, they'll look for the trees.
Absolutely.
They'll sit under the trees because that's where it's most pleasant to sit, unless they're sunbathers.
Yeah, well, but they're going to eventually find those shaded areas, whether it be a palm tree on a beach or whether it be an elm tree in a park, right? I think the living aspect of it too, that we're living creatures, or, that whole biophilia concept, right? Where we connect with living things, you can provide the amenity of shade and coolness and so on. And then not only that, certainly the concept of forest bathing and the chemicals that trees release, I think that also exists even in the urban setting. There's some effect of that taking place, no matter how barren the landscape. If there's trees there, it just changes it. And also the the trees themselves. A tree, the same species of tree, where it grows wild in the forest versus it's in a urban landscape, is very different in its stature, shape, and canopy shape. It's just not even the same. It just isn't the same, especially when it's grown singularly. I find that fascinating that they're just a completely different form than they would be when they're grown in a community of a forest.
That's what makes it delightful for guys like me to have connections in both domains. So I see the white pines in the woods of Nova Scotia, and I see the white pine in my backyard. Same species, but I get to see the trees functioning in a different way.
And how do you think the trees, I guess, I look at it as, when people ask about the tree, of course, being a tree person, people always have a question about a tree. Sort of like if you're a dentist or a doctor, they got a question about something, right? But one of my first comments is typically like, if you look at where the tree grows naturally and what the soil would be like around that tree, that's probably its biggest limiting factor. Not that it can't provide amenity, but that's one of the things that I don't know if the right term is missing. And I guess I'm looking to your view on this, your comment on that, because it's probably the urban landscape. The biggest challenge is heat, water, and not the cycling, especially the removal of leaves and trying to make grass and trees cohabit, let alone concrete. But yet trees somehow seem to adapt.
Well, yeah. The trees are a conundrum in the sense that sometimes you admit that it's very easy to kill a tree. And other times you need to admit that it is so hard to kill a tree. And so we've got these polar opposites and everything in between. And we could say that the urban environment is a pretty harsh environment for a tree to grow in, because we've messed with the soils. We've put in all this hardscape. We heat the place up with and we bathe it in urban pollutants and all these kinds of things. And yet I look at the rural environment for trees, and it's not if you go tree by tree, it's a tough place to live. When we get natural regeneration in the forests of Nova Scotia following a disturbance, could be a clear cut, could be a fire, could be a wind throw, we're getting anywhere from 20 to 60,000 stems per hectare in the region. Those are all individual trees. Okay, ratchet the clock forward 30 or 40 years. How many of those trees are still living? Well, it's probably down around 2,000, 3,000 maybe, when that stand starts to mature. What happened to all the rest of those trees? They died. So tree mortality in the woods is huge. And we never think about how tough it is, if you're an individual tree with a personality of some sort, to make it in the woods. And then when we plant trees in the streetscape and we get 50% mortality, we're all disappointed. Well, of course we're disappointed, because we paid $1,000 to put every tree in, maybe even more. And then we lose all that investment. But 50% mortality in the woods, unless it's a plantation where you have special crop trees and you're protecting those crop trees, you don't want 50% mortality. But the mortality of trees in the woods is absolutely huge. And when I look at the kinds of sites that we have in Nova Scotia, and you've seen them all across all the territory you've been in, out in the kind of the natural world, there are a lot of awful, awful sites for trees to grow on. I've seen jack pine growing on rock knobs in northwestern Ontario, where you'd say, where is the soil? The roots are simply going down in the cracks between. Now, they're not growing all that well, but they're alive and they're growing, they're green.
Yeah.
And they'll burn again in 30 or 40 years with a new crop of jack pine trees coming to succeed them. Whenever I go in the woods, I'm always looking for examples of trees growing on top of a boulder. So a seedling gets started in the moss on top of the boulder, and somehow or other it manages to hang on and keep growing. And then all of a sudden, the roots are looking around saying, where do I go? Well, they go down the side of the boulder. And you can have a meter-long root coming from a stem on top of going down into the soil. Well, that's not if you were to say, I'm going to plant this tree on top of a big piece of concrete out here, and say, come on, get serious. But I still think we need to pay way more attention. And I know that there are a few heavy-duty people in the tree business, like Jim Urban, who would pat me on the back for saying this, but we need to do a lot better with the soils.
Yeah.
If you're in Charlottetown, you've got quite a bit of kind of deep soil because that's where the city was established. But you're in Halifax, and from 10 meters to 10 meters over there, the soil goes from being 2 meters deep to being 20 centimeters deep. And so we're constantly putting trees in places where it's going to be a tough life for nutrients, for water, for stability. Stability is a big issue from wind in particular. So, I don't think you were able to make it with me on the tree tour downtown.
No, I was late getting there.
You came in late, yeah. But I showed our colleagues on the Tree Canada board how the city of Halifax was attempting to bring more trees to the deep interior of of downtown. And it always means soil amelioration. And sometimes that could mean structural soils. Sometimes that could mean soil cells, which we have moved toward. When you look at the cost of installing those trees and soil cells against the total cost of the development, it's not that much. When you look at it per tree, it's probably somewhere between $10,000 and $20,000 for the tree. And you'd say, what? You're spending that kind of money for one tree? Well, we are. And we're trying to give those trees a chance to flourish, not only to survive the early tough years, but to be there for us for the next 40, 50, maybe 80 years, giving us all those benefits in the downtown environment.
Well, and that's also the fascinating thing about trees. And I think one of the reasons that they have a place in most people, anything that outlives us, and it's pretty easy to recognize it transcends the language barrier and the culture barrier, country barrier. When you look at something that it's obvious, it was that old when you grew up, from your first memory of it, and it's still there. And you realize at some point it's going to be there after I'm gone. And then you pay a little more attention. You realize there's generations have passed here. There's something that, and then especially I find with us, as you learn about trees, like how the heck did it even make it, as you were talking about? And then, some don't, but some of them do. And then I often think about, like the project you're talking about, theoretically, and it's perfectly reasonable to say 100 years from now, or 120 or 80, whatever it is. But we're not, I hope we're somewhat of a memory, but you know what I mean? We're definitely not going to be able to say, see, I told you, or see, it was worth it, but somebody will value it. And there will be somebody that will recognize its origins and its beginnings and all that. And it's just a real fascinating thing to me that I think it's one of the, I don't know if it's mystical or what the word is. Maybe you could shed light on that or your view on that. But there's something that connects with people for something that lives that long. And as you get older, realize overcomes hurricanes, concrete. It's inspiring. The power of life in general is pretty astonishing, but the power of life in trees is more than I can describe. In a way, it's kind of legacy value. I mean, the house I'm sitting in was built in 1920-ish. And somebody planted the street full of elm trees and lindens and Norway maples. And that process probably took about 30 years to fill the street up to 2050. I don't know who did that, but somebody was farsighted enough to give me the street it's such a joy to walk the street and have all those trees. I wouldn't have made the same species decisions, but that's beside the point, especially the Norway maples. So then whoever did that left me a legacy that I'm far more excited about than the legacy of this 100-year-old house. And the amount of maintenance I need to spend on the house is way more than we need to spend on the whole street for maintenance of those older trees. But now I think, you hear this expression that societies mature when old people like us plant trees, the shade of which we'll never sit in. And so I feel like that's where my legacy needs to be, is in the natural features of the urban landscape. Yeah. Well, and I wanted to talk a little bit about this. I try to, at some point, we call it the Human Forestry Podcast. I guess it's an age factor to a certain degree, but thinking about how it suddenly hit me how similar human interactions are to forest interactions, or how you can draw parallels. Maybe not how similar they are, but how you can draw parallels to, the supporting one another, the connections, survival, through adversity, woundwood particularly, and how trees respond to loading, compared to stress in humans, injuries that occur to trees, and yet they survive, and they'll they display the wound, but and yet overcome it, and even are stronger. I don't know if stronger for it, but produce wood strong enough that they're as strong as they were before the wound. And have you ever pondered that at all, or thought about that?
So, yes, and I often have to guard against anthropomorphizing trees. Because I like to talk about trees as if they had a thought process, and
me too.
Directional, that they could be a planner for life. And I'm not a fan of that kind of, there's some recent books out, as you know, that push that agenda maybe a little bit too hard. But I find when I talk to people, I want to talk more about the differences between people and trees rather than the similarities. And you're right, there are a lot of similarities, but a lot of people have never really thought through the fact that trees grow on their exterior and only on their exterior. They're always adding layers to their exterior. And it's even exterior when it's a bud about to become a 40 centimeter twig. That's kind of exterior growth. Whereas we, and the animal life, grows on the interior. Our bones expand at the same time as the rest of us is expanding. So it can mean that there's a lot of dead material on the inside of a tree, especially in the trunk. And the tree is still functioning totally fine. And that interior material could be full of microbes decomposing that material. I've sat inside trees where there was a picnic table inside the tree. I mean, this is totally fascinating, that trees are alive on the exterior. And, when it's small trees, we have to treat that exterior very gently, because if you look at the whippersnipper damage by unscrupulous lawn care people all over the cityscape, it's no wonder we have to put these drainage pipe sleeves on them to protect them, because people don't actually think that a tree is growing on its exterior and it's tender. And so we need to kind of respect that. And right now my street is under recapitalization for sidewalk stuff and curbs and new water pipes, and the amount of tree roots that are exposed, I'm just cringing every day. I hope those trees are able to respond back. I hope they have they're living under you can't kill that tree, rather than blow on it and you'll kill that tree.
Yeah, no, it's true. They like the way they're living on the outside, and the older they get, and it's interesting too, the lower ground parts, that's where more of the decay is. I mean, you move up into the upper canopy of a 100-year-old tree, and you're in 3-inch diameter branches. They're very much like the small tree that was there 100 years before. Anatomically, it's quite. I find it. The whole concept of the cambium layer covering the entire structure,
I know,
as alive, and how close to the surface that is. And even at the trunk, the base of the striations, where it's very short distance through some phloem into the cambium, even though you may have a 3-inch bark plate right beside it, but there's these little grooves where you're not far from the living part either, right? It's fascinating to me.
It's the place where you can kill a tree too, because if you look at how emerald ash borer kills trees, they're right there under the bark.
Yeah.
Those larvae are feeding away, and that changes the opportunity for water and nutrients to move up and down, and bingo, the ash tree's done.
Well, and particularly with blight-type infestations or diseases, that anything that interrupts the vascular system quickly, can Dutch elm disease is a great example, right? I don't know why they never did call it a blight. It certainly fits the term.
Yeah. And why they assigned it to the Dutch.
Well, isn't that because of the logs that came along?
Yeah, but they weren't Dutch. The Dutch were just transporting them.
Right. They were just shipped from Holland.
Yeah.
They were
Exactly.
I know. I mean, Well, Tony, any comments? Been listening patiently. Like
That's interesting. I really like that concept of, trees exist on the outside. I mean, I knew it, right? But I never articulated it that well. That's a cool. And if you want to go back to some allegories to humanity, you could almost say that at some points as a human, when we say we got to just go one day at a time or 1 minute at a time, we are kind of living our life just exterior at that moment, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's some things now obviously that's a great way to go through life, but it's not realistic for an animal, right? Because we have the interior part of it too. So I think like I said, I know trees grow on the outside, and there's one of my favorite Dr. Shigo quotes. Listening to him speak at a conference, is he had a chunk of wood around a wood, and he points to the heartwood, and he says, "Ask everybody, is it alive?" And some people say yes, and some people say no. And he's like, "Well, is it dead?" And he's like, "Well, it's both." Classic Dr. Shigo, right? So I understand it, but that was just a wonderful way to articulate it. They just grow on the outside.
They do. Yes, they do.
I'd like to keep this conversation going for a long time, but I have an appointment pretty soon that I need to get going on.
No problem.
No worries. We don't have a set agenda or time. They go. Well, I guess I'll be seeing you soon.
Very soon.
Yeah, in Montreal. To our listeners, you may have picked it up, but Peter and I are. I'm a new member to Tree Canada Board of Directors, and Peter, you've been there a little while.
Just a year ahead of you.
Okay, and so that was how I got to get the opportunity to invite him to be on the show, and I'm glad I did. And it was good to get to know you a little bit better, and I look forward to working with you more in the future. And thanks for being a guest.
Yeah, you're welcome. And you were most generous to think of me for this assignment, and I've enjoyed every minute of it. Lovely to talk freely.
I got to know, when you guys sit down for the Tree Canada Board, do you sit in rings? I would hope so. I would hope so.
One ring, and what's interesting is that I don't know who does this, but somebody strategically places us. They place our name tags on the table before we sit down, and I think they're engineering the social structure of the board interactions. And what I like is if I can see Martha's eyes and I can see your eyes, Dwayne, because sometimes we 3 forestry people among the 12, the other 9 are not into trees except to be on the board. We need to catch each other's eye thinking, whoa, where's this conversation going? Mm-hmm. But if they put the 3 of us together, we'd probably be, making too much noise for the...
Yeah,
exactly.
I do find it a fascinating group of people to be involved with from a tree perspective. I've been on lots of boards and committees, but never one with a diversity of professional background, I guess.
Yeah. Well, it is fascinating, that's for sure.
From politicians to big business people. And then there's us tree folks.
No, and this afternoon I'm off to discuss Canadian Food Inspection Agency's proposed new regulations around emerald ash borer. Yeah, and it doesn't look good. I think there's going to be some controversy in this meeting this afternoon. And I'm glad I'm not leading it. I'm going to be right in there punching.
Awesome. Well, I look forward to hearing about it from you later this week.
I hope you'll be at dinner Wednesday night. I'll tell you all about it.
Okay, I'm not sure exactly when I'm flying in, but I hope I will be there. Thanks again.
Nice to meet you, Tony.
Yep, it was nice to meet you too, Peter.